Imagine being a globally respected religious leader, right? You're in a genuine emergency situation, and you realize the only people actually coming to save you are your neighborhood uh, gangster friends.
Wow.
Yeah. Meanwhile, your devout, highly religious brothers, the ones who literally know all the scriptures by heart, they're just nowhere to be found.
That is heavy.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. For you listening, we're unpacking a massive, multifaceted document today titled Islam Past and Current. And our mission is to take you on a pretty unique journey.
Yeah, definitely a unique one.
Right, because we're going to start with this wide-angle historical lens on major Islamic movements, and then we're going to zoom all the way in to see how those sweeping global forces trickle down to, break apart a single family at the dinner table.
The contrast in these sources is just striking. I mean,
Yeah.
we are looking at how vast ideological frameworks are built over centuries, and then analyzing the incredibly intimate human cost of those exact ideologies. And it's worth stating clearly right up front for anyone listening. Our source material today dives into some politically sensitive territory, right? Including the intellectual origins of militant ideologies.
Right, which is heavy stuff.
It is. So our role here isn't to endorse any theological viewpoint or, take political sides. We are acting purely as guides. We're impartially tracing the historical dots as they are laid out in the text, just to understand how certain ideas evolved and eventually impacted personal lives.
That's a great point to keep in mind. So, to understand the personal side of this document later on, we have to start with the foundational vocabulary, right?
Right.
The text immediately tackles two terms that just dominate global news, which people constantly use as if they are the exact same thing. Wahhabism and Salafism. Let's look at the actual mechanisms behind these, and where did they begin?
Well, they begin in very different centuries and for very different reasons. So Wahhabism is the older movement. It originates around 1744 in the Arabian Peninsula. It was founded by Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. And you have to picture the environment he was looking at, right? He saw people venerating saints, asking the dead for intercession, and just incorporating all these local superstitions into their faith.
And I'm guessing he wasn't a fan of
Not at all. He viewed all of this as a complete corruption of monotheism. So Wahhabism began as this aggressively puritanical reform movement.
Okay.
The goal was to strip away centuries of cultural traditions and enforce a strictly literal interpretation of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet.
So the mechanism there is basically purification by subtraction, just, strip it all away. But if that's the mid-1700s in Arabia, where does Salafism actually enter the picture?
Yeah, so Salafism is a product of the late 19th century, and the psychological catalyst was entirely different. I mean, it emerged as a direct reaction to European colonialism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as Western powers began dominating the Muslim world, scholars were looking around asking, how did we fall so far behind? And the term Salafi actually means follower of the pious predecessors.
Meaning the early Muslims.
Exactly. We're referring to the first three generations. So the original Salafi movement was this broad intellectual call to return to those early principles. They thought that was the way to revitalize the Muslim world and, well, stand up to colonial powers.
So based on the text, it seems like Wahhabism eventually just gets absorbed into this broader Salafi movement. It's almost like a categorization rule. Like all Wahhabis are Salafists, but not all Salafists are Wahhabis.
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Sort of like how all squares are rectangles, but you can't say all rectangles are squares.
Yes, exactly. Salafism became the broader umbrella, containing many different intellectual orientations. Wahhabism just became one very specific, highly conservative, Saudi-aligned iteration under that umbrella.
Okay, that makes sense.
And a fascinating detail the text points out is that the followers of Abd al-Wahhab actually reject the term Wahhabi.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They view it as a derogatory label given to them by their opponents, to imply they are some new separate sect. They actually prefer to be called Salafi or Muwahhidun, which translates to Unitarians.
I see. They want to be seen as orthodox, not as a splinter group. But here is where the text throws a massive theological wrench into the works. It brings up a group called the Quranists.
Oh, yeah?
And it specifically asks if a Quranist can be a Salafi, and the answer is just a violent collision of ideas.
A total collision.
Yeah.
Mainstream Salafists consider the concept of a Quranist Salafi to be a complete contradiction. I mean, they place Quranists entirely outside the bounds of Orthodox Islam.
Wow.
Yeah, often labeling the movement as heresy or bid'ah, and sometimes outright disbelief or kufr.
I want to break down the why of that friction for you listening. Salafism relies on following the early generations of Muslims, but my understanding from the sources is that they also rely heavily on the Hadith, right? The recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad.
They absolutely rely on the Hadith. For a Salafi, and really for mainstream Sunni Islam, the Hadith is the indispensable lens through which you understand the Quran.
Okay.
Like, the Quran might tell you to pray, but the Hadith tells you exactly how to pray. Quranists fundamentally reject that premise.
They do.
Yeah. They argue that the Quran is fully detailed, complete, and perfectly clear all on its own. They reject the Hadith entirely as a source of religious law, arguing that, well, these records were compiled by fallible humans centuries after the fact and are full of contradictions.
So they're basically removing the historical human element from the law entirely. The text mentions this isn't a new concept, though. It traces the roots of rejecting the Hadith way back to 8th century figures like Dirar ibn Ammar.
Right. But it really organized into formal movements much later. The organized movements materialized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries simultaneously in different parts of the world.
Like where?
Well, you had the Al-Quran movement forming in India and figures like Dr. Muhammad Tawfiq Siddiqui writing in Egypt. They were arguing that only the Quran was meant to be eternally binding. But again, to a Salafi, rejecting the historical consensus of the early scholars is the ultimate red line.
Which brings us perfectly to the most dramatic historical shift in the source material. We've defined Salafism as a movement to follow the early predecessors, but the text reveals that the psychological meaning of the word Salafi was essentially hijacked.
It really was.
And it centers on the relationship between an Egyptian scholar named Muhammad Abdu and his disciple Rashid Rida. Let's talk about Abdu first.
So Muhammad Abdu is, he's one of the most vital figures in modern Islamic history. Born in 1849, he is considered a founder of Islamic modernism. When we talk about Salafism in the late 19th century, Abdu was practicing a rational Salafism.
Rational Salafism.
Right. He was exiled in 1882 for political reasons, but eventually returned and rose to become the Grand Mufti of Egypt in 1899.
And the Grand Mufti is effectively the highest religious legal authority in the country. The text is very careful to clarify a historical misconception here, too.
Oh, about Al-Azhar University.
Yeah, noting that while he tried desperately to reform the curriculum at Al-Azhar to include modern sciences, he was never actually the rector there.
True. His focus was entirely on legal and social reform because he fundamentally believed Islam and modern science were inherently compatible. He argued that the early Muslims succeeded precisely because they were adaptable and used reason.
Right.
And he didn't just theorize this, he applied it to the law. Like, as Grand Mufti, he allowed Muslims to use postal savings banks that paid interest. Traditionally, all interest was viewed as forbidden usury.
But he changed that.
Well, Abdu looked at the mechanism of the law. The ban on usury was meant to prevent the exploitation of the desperate, right? A postal savings bank, however, helped everyday people build wealth safely.
Ah, so he's looking at the spirit of the law rather than just the rigid letter. The text says he also expanded charitable endowments, known as waqf, and placed heavy restrictions on polygamy and unilateral divorce.
He did.
His entire method prioritized maslaha, which means public welfare, over taqlid, which is the blind imitation of medieval scholars.
And that rejection of blind imitation is just key to his philosophy. He even co-authored a pioneering work of Quranic commentary called Tafsir al-Manar, which approached the text from a social and literary perspective rather than just, repeating old legal rulings.
Okay, let me challenge his strategy here, though. Abdu is the Grand Mufti. He has immense power. He sees the system is broken by blind imitation, but he actively refuses to found his own school of law, his own madhab.
Right.
Isn't that like a revolutionary Supreme Court justice refusing to write a binding precedent because they want every lower court judge to just figure it out themselves? I mean, why not codify his reforms to protect them? Did that idealism backfire?
That is a great analogy. And yes, because for Abdu, codifying his reforms into a new rigid school of law would just be building a new cage. He believed that the requirement to blindly follow a single scholar was the exact mechanism causing the Islamic world to stagnate.
Oh, I see.
His ultimate goal wasn't to force people to agree with his specific rulings. It was to reopen the door of ijtihad, independent, critical reasoning for every educated Muslim. So yeah, he was an idealist.
And unfortunately, idealism is highly vulnerable to human trauma. Enter the disciple, Rashid Rida.
Yeah, Rashid Rida started out as Abdu's most passionate student. He literally moved from Syria to Cairo just to work with him. It was Rida who founded the magazine Al-Manar to broadcast Abdu's progressive ideas across the globe.
Okay.
But after Abdu died in 1905, global geopolitics shifted violently.
Right. The Ottoman Empire collapses. European colonization aggressively expands across the Middle East and North Africa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And think about the psychological impact of that.
Yeah.
Rita's watching the political and cultural structures of his world just shatter under Western military and economic power.
That has to be terrifying.
It is. When a society feels conquered or existentially threatened, the natural human defense mechanism is rarely to adopt the philosophy of the conqueror. The instinct is to build a fortress. You retreat into the most rigid, uncompromising version of your own identity.
So Rita abandons his mentor's rationalism. The West is no longer something to learn science from. It's the enemy that destroyed his world.
By the 1920s, Rita makes a massive pivot. He allies himself with the puritanical Wahhabi movement emerging in the Arabian Peninsula. He begins arguing that literal texts must always override logic.
Wow, a complete 180.
Literally. He limits that independent reasoning Abdu fought for and starts adopting Wahhabi theological views that his mentor had explicitly rejected as primitive.
He engineers a complete reversal of the term Salafiyya. He takes it from meaning rational, adaptable reform and turns it into literalist, anti-rational traditionalism.
And the geopolitical domino effect of Rita's psychological retreat is just staggering. Rita's newly politicized anti-Western ideology directly influenced a young school teacher named Sasan al-Banna. In 1928, al-Banna takes these ideas and operationalizes them, founding the Muslim Brotherhood as a mass political movement.
And the sources show how that movement mutates again, right? A later Brotherhood ideologue, Syed Qutb, develops this concept called Jahiliyyah.
Right. Jahiliyyah originally referred to the state of ignorance before Islam. Qutb kind of weaponized the term.
How so?
He argued that modern societies, even Muslim ones, had reverted to this state of pre-Islamic ignorance, making them illegitimate and, crucially, making them valid targets for violent revolution.
So you have the intellectual framework for revolution. Then, in the 1960s, persecuted members of the Muslim Brotherhood flee Egypt and seek refuge in Saudi Arabia,
where Qutb's revolutionary political ideology merges with the strict literalist theology of Saudi Wahhabism.
A perfect storm.
It really was. That merger creates a highly combustible hybrid Salafi jihadism. This is the ideological bedrock that would eventually produce groups like Al-Qaeda and figures like Osama bin Laden.
It is a devastating historical irony. A 19th century modernist who championed public welfare or independent thought accidentally laid the foundation for modern militant extremism, all because his disciples' psychological reaction to colonialism hijacked his legacy.
It perfectly illustrates how ideologies harden when they are subjected to political trauma and human ego.
Which brings us to the most fascinating transition in this document. We've seen how tribalism and rigidity scale up to reshape geopolitics. But the source material now forces us to look at how that exact same rigidity scales down to the family dinner table.
Yes.
We move to a deeply personal account written by a modern-day imam.
Right. The imam is observing the very real human consequences of this historical hardening. And he shares a story that just completely baffled him. He looks at his half-brothers on his father's side.
Okay.
These are men who embody modern religious success. They are highly civilized, religiously devout, well-behaved men who know all the texts. But the imam realizes a painful truth. If he were ever in a genuine crisis, none of them would actually come to his aid.
Meanwhile, he looks at his friends from his youth guys he knew from his judo days. He plainly describes some of them as having gangster behavior, involved in rough or criminal elements. Yet he knows with absolute certainty that if he or his family were in danger, those rough friends would drop everything and race to help him.
He struggles with this heavily. He writes that he thought he would have to wait until the day of judgment to ask God why his devout brothers were so indifferent while his rough friends were so fiercely loyal.
Man, that's a tough realization.
It is. He uses specific frameworks to diagnose this. He says his brothers possess the theory and the knowledge of Islam, but they lack its virtue. Specifically, they lack ithar, which is the internal spirit of preferring others over yourself.
So it's like they know the rules of the game, but they refuse to be team players. The imam points out that his brothers confuse knowledge with virtue. What terminology does he use for his childhood friends, though?
He says they possess futuwa, which translates to a kind of spiritual chivalry, and they possess gaira, which in this context means a protective jealousy for his honor.
Protective jealousy.
Yeah, they actually keep their distance from him on a normal day so their reputations don't tarnish his standing as an imam. But the second he needs them, they are there. He realizes that isn't gangster behavior, that is the core of honor.
Wait, the text mentions Genghis Khan here, Temujin, the Mongol conqueror. How does an imam connect one of history's most brutal warlords to modern Islamic practice?
It's a pretty brilliant comparative analysis. The Imam points out that before Genghis Khan conquered half the world, he prayed to a sky god because he was horrified by the state of his own society.
Really?
Yeah, he saw his people violating the sacred, disrespecting their leadership, and abandoning their loyalties. Temujin understood a fundamental sociological truth. A society completely collapses when trust and mutual obligation break down.
I see.
The Imam argues that Islam provided the ultimate framework for trust and loyalty to orphans, neighbors, and strangers. But modern practice has hollowed it out into a series of empty rituals.
And the imam identifies 3 specific mechanisms driving this hollowing out. First, love has been reduced to self-interest and bloodlines. It's purely transactional.
Right.
Second, the rise of personality cults among religious leaders. The text mentions the danger of riya, which means showing off your piety for social status, something the Prophet heavily warned against.
And third, the hijacking of titles. Using words like sheikh to accumulate wealth and prestige rather than as a marker of someone who serves the community. All of this feeds into what the Imam calls asabiya.
Asabiya.
Tribalism. Exactly. It is the primitive instinct of my group versus your group, but dressed up in religious clothing. The Imam argues that modern believers have made God the flag of their specific tribe, rather than the Lord of all worlds.
And his solution to this tribalism is striking. He argues that if divine mercy actually encompasses all things, then it must have left fingerprints everywhere. You can't just hoard it for your sect.
He explicitly states that a believer must recognize those divine fingerprints in Christians, in Moses, in the Buddha, in Confucius, and in indigenous elders who maintain a sacred trust with the earth.
That's beautiful.
He is arguing that engaging with the global world isn't a threat to your religious identity, it is the ultimate fulfillment of it. If we refuse to recognize the mercy in others, we will inevitably fight them, and society will perish.
So if tribalism and empty ritual feed the ego, how does an individual actually fight back? You can't just mandate that people stop being tribal. The final section of our text offers a highly psychological, almost cognitive behavioral tool to combat this toxicity. It introduces the dynamic between the boast and the curse.
The Imam breaks down the human ego into these 2 poles. The boast is what happens when the ego is well fed. I, me, and myself are succeeding, and the ego basically demands an audience to witness it.
Okay, so if the boast is the ego when it's well fed, I'm guessing the curse is what happens when that same ego feels starved of attention or slighted.
Precisely. The curse is the toxic byproduct of an ignored or bruised ego. The Imam shares a story of being at a birthday party, talking to a highly privileged, highly educated elder in the community, a man with 3 degrees.
Okay.
The Imam suggests to him that in their circles, people actually curse more ardently than they pray. And this distinguished elder immediately agrees.
Wow. The text provides a fascinating local timeline for this community in Cape Town to explain how they got to this point, actually. It mentions the creep of witchcraft around 1850.
Which represents a period where the community felt isolated and began leaning heavily into superstition and occult practices rather than faith.
Then it mentions a period of skew Sharia in 1947.
Meaning a time when traditional laws were heavily distorted, either compromised by local cultural decay or bent under the pressures of the encroaching apartheid state.
And then finally, the arrival of the extreme Wahhabi and Salafi influences in the 1970s. So this community has been violently swinging between superstition, compromised laws, and puritanical extremism for a century.
Yet, amidst all that historical whiplash, the Imam points to his own siblings, Thuraya, Tharwa, and Mahdi. They didn't fall into the boast or the curse.
Oh.
They quietly maintained a balance through all those historical waves, living with exceptionally high personal character without ever making a display of their piety.
They neutralized the ego, which leads to this incredible reflection from the Imam's daughter. She writes to him about how she processes the toxic energy of cursing. She calls it the dark side of prayer. But she developed a specific mental defense mechanism.
Yes, this part is fascinating.
When she suspects someone in her community is cursing her or harboring ill will, she uses a single word, release.
She treats it like a cognitive behavioral tool. She understands that a curse or someone's toxic tribalism only has power over your reality if you allow it to take up residence in your mind.
To illustrate this, she tells a story about being at a coffee shop. She sees a young boy covered in severe skin sores, clearly in deep physical and emotional distress. His mother is nearby ordering coffee. The daughter feels this intense, visceral urge to intervene, to do something to help.
But she pauses. She realizes that physically intervening might actually embarrass the mother or make the boy feel more alienated. It would satisfy her own ego's need to act the savior, but it might harm them.
So she forces herself to act completely normal outwardly, to make the mother feel accepted in that public space. But internally, she goes to work. All day long, every time she thinks of that boy, she pictures him whole and healed. She holds him in her mind with intense positive intention.
The text frames this internal presence as the truest prayer. She transformed her feeling of helplessness into a quiet, internal healing practice.
That is such a profound inversion of everything we've discussed. What stands out to me here is that she didn't actually do anything physical to help the boy, but the text frames this as the truest prayer. She abandons the outward performance of helping in order to maintain a pure, internal spirit of love. It flips the script on the earlier point about action versus ritual.
It perfectly ties the entire analysis together. I mean, we traced how a rational, adaptable worldview under Muhammad Abduh was hijacked by political panic and tribalism under Rashid Rida, creating a global fracture.
Right.
We saw how that ideological fracture manifests at a family dinner table, where devout men possess the knowledge of their faith but lack the virtue to help their own brother.
And finally, we arrive at the individual remedy. The antidote to the sweeping tribalism of history and the intimate betrayals of family isn't to argue louder or boast harder or force your reforms on everyone else. The antidote is the quiet, internal discipline of choosing release over cursing, of holding others in your mind with grace rather than spite.
It requires immense strength to put down the armor of group identity and practice that kind of vulnerable virtue.
It is a remarkable journey from the geopolitical to the deeply personal. So, to you listening, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over today. Think about the modern digital tribes you belong to, whether they are political, cultural, or social. How often does your online community engage in the secular version of cursing those outside the group? What would happen if, the next time you feel that tribal outrage bubbling up in your feed, you paused, put down the heavy armor of your group identity, and practiced the daughter's concept of release instead?